we're going to turn it over now to our three guests. Pastor, I can call you all pastors, right? You're all ordained or licensed or recognized or whatnot. So Pastor Nate Stone, Pastor Summer Morling, and Pastor Gary Irby, right? Is that good? Okay. So they're going to introduce themselves. I'm not going to try to do it for them. And then they're going to give a little bit about their context in church planting and all that. And then if you can also just say a word about young adults, how your interactions with young adults have worked, and help us to follow along with this new ecclesiology methods that we're learning as best you can, to give us a sense of how you feel you're embodying maybe a new ecclesiology that's happening in Seattle. And then we'll move to some Q&A. So please do write down questions. Summer, can I invite you to go first? Okay.
Well, I am Summer Morling, and my husband Mark and I are co-pastors of a church called Sanctuary Church, which meets in Taproot Theater, which is not a movie theater, it's a drama theater in the Greenwood neighborhood of Seattle. I know Martine because he and his wife and daughter worship with us. Sanctuary is a 14-year-old Christian Reformed church plant. We're about 100 on a Sunday morning, 30 of which are young children. So we're dealing with figuring out children's ministry kind of from birth up, which is our current challenge. I would say that Sanctuary fits in the neighborhood incarnation model. And as I read your chapter on that, it was sprinkled through with many of my favorite people. So we worship in a theater. We have officed in a variety of different places in the neighborhood because we don't have a building midweek except for our coffee shop, which we run. So we run a coffee shop called The Green Bean that opened shortly after the church started meeting in the neighborhood. And it has been kind of like the Israelites wandering in the wilderness around Greenwood. We were burnt down and then torn down and now are being shut down. And so that is a whole different story. And we also took on a preschool 3 years ago now that had been started by one of our partner churches, and they weren't able to continue running it. And out of a sense of this is totally who our congregation is, and this is a very evident need in the community, we took the preschool over and have been running the preschool. So in my role as pastor, I have managed a coffee shop, worked as a volunteer in the coffee shop. I now run a preschool and then attempt to have a family and pastor. So that's a bit about our community. Do you want us to dive into kind of all of these questions, or do you want us to introduce ourselves and then come back to it? Okay, so I'll stop there for now.
I'll go next. So again, Gary Irby. My role is I lead church planting for Southern Baptists. And so as a manifestation of that, I started Seattle church planting just a little over 20 years ago, actually 20 years and about a week and a half ago. And then 5 years ago, started leading Northwest church planting for us. So that's Washington, Oregon, Northern Idaho. So forgive me sometimes if I slip in, I start citing things about the broader, and I'll have to keep reminding, come back to Seattle. Kind of a little background. So that's, the very high view that I lead a network. We have 500 churches total in the Northwest. About 100 of those are 5 years old or less. Out of those 100, a little more than half are non-English or second generation multi-ethnic Asian or something like that. We're in 20 to 30 languages, more than 50 nationalities. So it's really cool, actually. It's a lot of fun and a lot of great food, as you can imagine. So I've been doing that, but I grew up in church planting. My dad, my granddad were both church planters. I was going to be a high school choir teacher until God said, no, this is what you're going to do. Went into ministry about 38 years ago, just over 30 years in church planting itself. And like I said, the last 20 and 5 in those two roles. So the other things that kind of relate to this is, a little over 10 years ago, I started a coalition of Northwest church planting networks that has more than 20 different networks that relate to it. Some more directly, more involved, others kind of more on the periphery, but it's a variety of groups. So like Converge and Stadia and Baptist groups and Assemblies of God and Foursquare and Christian Evangelical Association. So it's it's built around the premise of what can we do together if we can't do a part, if we don't care who gets the credit except God, go. And then we help each other with facilities and planters and finances and training and coaching and assessing. So our job is to help each other, to help church planners so that church planners can focus on the mission and not get caught up in all the weeds that go with it. So that's kind of my background along with some other roles. So.
Hey. My name's Nate. Hi, guys. I know some of you in here. Thanks for hanging out today. In general, you can tell who the real pastors are. They have detailed notes. I have chicken scratch and wine. So anyway, I hope whatever I have to say today is just helpful. But I definitely don't consider myself an expert. Whenever someone Yeah, I will. Whenever someone asks me if I'll share stuff, I'm like, sure. Should I tell them I don't know anything, or should I just wait until I already have a mic? I already have a mic, so here we go. I help facilitate a community called Bar Church. We meet in Ballard. It is what it sounds like. We meet in bars. We're actually just getting ready to have our 2-year anniversary, so we're relatively new. So we were meeting in beer halls and breweries either once or twice a month for our first year or so, and then we've been pursuing our own space really from the beginning, and just got into our own space here in February, and then launched and opened that space in March. We're doing some similar stuff too. I think what a lot of people are doing in this new iteration or whatever this looks like for church. We have church twice a month, and it is what it sounds like. There's no bait and switch. We're drinking Bloody Marys and mimosas and beer mimosas, and people don't have to drink, but they definitely do. We have a really eclectic community. We have probably, I would say, 2/3 of our community identifies as Jesus followers, but we also have another probably third of our community that would say they self-identify as agnostic or atheist or Buddhist. We have a really eclectic community right now, and we're really proud of that, honestly. And so we do that, and then at all other times, we run an event space called Cathedral, and it is a for-profit entity that donates all profit to charity. So, Friday night, someone had their rehearsal dinner there, and they chose Treehouse Organization as their charity that they would choose to help with their event. So they rented the space. The profit from their event will go towards Treehouse Organization to resource foster kids. So anyway, that's a little tidbit about what we're about. In terms of where we fit in the mold, it's interesting. I'm really rebellious, and so whenever someone asks me to pigeonhole, I can feel myself immediately resist it. But if we had to be categorized as something, I guess we would be a new community, but I think we have a little bit of elements of each. I would say even we probably most resemble that next iteration, progressive evangelical multi-site, only instead of multi-site, it's just 100 people drinking beers on a Sunday morning. So maybe not quite that, but I think we're probably, if we had to be in some iteration, it'd be the new community. You wanted us to mention a little bit of what our community consists of in terms of age round. Do we have a lot of millennials?
We're gonna make. Let me just apologize right now. We're gonna make copious use of the mics so that we can catch all of our questions and comments for we want to be able to share this with others, the recording. So why don't you guys now, if you could each just say a quick word about young adults and your experience as church plants. I think that's a big question for the Christian community. And I know that in the interviews I have done personally, a lot of folks said, my church plant couldn't survive without double income, no kids. I've literally had a pastor say that. And so I'm just curious what your experiences are, and then we can continue the conversation from there.
Should I start, and then we'll just, great. So, I am one, a young adult, so that kind of helps in my context a little bit. You attract who you are, I think, in general. And so our community is almost exclusively young adults and young families. I have 2 little girls, one almost 3 and one almost 1. And we have probably, on any given Sunday, anywhere from 5 to 20 kids, and they're all under the age of 5. I mean, they're all really little. And then the rest of our community is made up. I'm 33, and I'm probably the median age in our community. Almost everyone in our community, or we would say they identify as like a part of Bar Church, is a young adult. And a lot of that is, again, I think you attract who you are. A lot of it also is we are doing our best to like create something that replicates real life. And so I think this is important. We get a lot of these questions, especially in environments like this, like, ooh, you got them. You told them they could have beer, and that's how you got them there. That's just not who we are. That wasn't a strategic move. I like drinking beer and having real meaningful conversations around that environment, that proverbial fire pit. And so our community, that's the environment that they seem to operate the best in. And so we weren't like, how do we get the youngies to church? We were like, what do we do already? Where do our meaningful conversations already occur and exist about spirituality and pain and struggle and doubt? They already exist at a table over a pint of beer or a mimosa. And so we're like, why don't we just do that? So that's you said short. That's about as short as I'm going to get. So
I would say that Sanctuary today reflects me. So 14 years ago when the church started, Randy Rowland was the founding pastor. He's a baby boomer. And the staff that he brought on with him were all straight out of college. And so the congregation really reflected that 14 years ago. But you fast forward now 14 years, and the folks that were straight out of college are now in their mid-30s with kids. And so we have added some younger singles, young marrieds. But I would say as I reflect on what my role as pastor has been with that demographic, it is very much one-on-one engagement. So it's me getting together with Lola, who she's in high school, but getting together for coffee with her and just hearing about her life. It's pursuing the SPU student and picking her up for lunch at her dorm room and taking her out for lunch and just hearing about her life. And I've also started meeting for one-on-one spiritual direction with a handful of kind of folks in that demographic as well. So I think there was a season where we went to the SPU church fair and put out our, booth with our, sign. And my husband felt like largely he came away like really glad to have connected with all of the other pastors that were there and not having really connected with any of the students. And so I think that relational one-on-one is what that has looked like for us. But I would say that, I don't know where millennial ends and I begin. I don't think I can call myself a millennial. Like, I don't think anyone would probably look at me and go, oh, young adult. Like, although I feel young. My hair gives me away. So I don't know. I think that our congregation has a fair number of millennials. You could probably answer the question better than me, Martine.
Yeah, so I've probably been reaching millennials the longest. When I was reaching them, they were called nursery and preschool program. No, as far as our church plants, they're very intentional. The majority of our English speaking are reaching millennials. That's the majority of their church. As a matter of fact, their heart's desire, their prayer is we need more older adults to help us mentor these people. And so they're praying that people will see that as a mission to come and join them in that. They don't have the issues reaching the younger adults. That's pretty much what it is. And so ways in which they're doing that, it's highly relational. There's, Paul, I became all things to all men, that by all means I might win some. Henry Blackaby put it and this again from an earlier generation, the Bible's first and foremost a book about relationships. And so we focus on relationships, but a lot of times we feel like we have the best kept secret in town in what's happening in some of our churches. So what ways do we go to engage in them? And so it's serving them, it's meeting them where they are, engaging in the things that they like to do, not just setting up a booth, but helping them move in and having things that are things they're already being a part of. And a big part of that is that millennials tend to want to be a part of something bigger than themselves. So we don't say just serve the community. Don't just serve the community, serve with the community. So engage in what they're doing to serve, invite them to engage in what we're doing to serve. As we're rubbing elbows, they're like, why are you guys doing this? Well, everything for us leads back to conversations about the gospel. I didn't say what mine was. We are, our predominant is the Great Commission teams. The other one would be the neighborhood incarnational. We have some of ours that are much more focused on city and bigger. We have others that we have these networks within our network that are focused on taking Seattle one neighborhood at a time, Bellevue one neighborhood at a time, Tacoma, and so on. And they're not all about us doing it. It's about us doing it. And so part of that for them is not just what they can do, but what can we collectively do. And so, like I'm thinking about today, we had Epic Life. I was going to mention, because some of you may know some of our churches, and this might give a point of reference. Some of the ones in Seattle, we have Hallows Church both in Fremont and West Seattle, Roots Church, The Well, Epic Life Church, Pike Place Church, Dwelling Place, New Story, and then a number of language churches that I could tell you the names if I could pronounce them all. But in those, they're doing things with the community. So like today in Seattle, several churches got together, didn't do their own worship service. I think it was probably like 10 churches came together and had 800 people together for worship and to pray together about how to serve their community and reach their community. A bunch of other churches over in Bellevue, like 3,000 people serving the community. That's what they did today instead of having worship services. So just finding ways to engage the community where they already are.
Thank you. Let's go ahead and open it up for questions, because I definitely want to hear what your questions are, and then if you guys don't come up with them, then I will start interrogating our panelists. Does anyone have anything that they want to ask at this point?
And if not, we'll ask ourselves, because we know what we want.
Well, maybe to get some things going, maybe I like that you talked a little bit about your network. Summer and Nate, maybe you can talk a little about what you're seeing in your networks, what people are trying. I know that, for instance, the network that you're in is the CRC, that there's other church plants that are our sister churches. And then Nate, you come from a network because you've been working as a pastor for a while. So just kind of what's interesting or what you like to try.
So the Christian Reformed Church has definitely prioritized this concept of neighborhood churches, and Seattle is one of the cities where that's really been experimented with. And so there are a number of small neighborhood churches kind of clustered in the North Seattle area. So there's Sanctuary, which runs the Green Bean Coffee House and the preschool, but then a mile away there's a Wake Church, which was planted out of Sanctuary 10 years ago, that runs the Aurora Commons, which is described as kind of a living room to Aurora. So they have groups for survivors of prostitution, and they do a lot to care for the homeless community along Aurora. There's Emmaus Road, which was in Belltown and then moved into kind of the North Seattle area. And they are co-located with another Christian Reformed church, Harbor Church, that was the one that started the preschool. And all of these churches have different flavors, but all of them have in common this real focus on a particular neighborhood. And I appreciated reading kind of, Chris, your summary of what these different types of churches do well. And I appreciate just the description that you gave of a comprehensive task on a limited scale, that I think for all of us in the Christian Reformed Church, we very much believe that God is active in all of life and that he is about the redemption of all things. And so for me to get my mind around being someone who is active with God in his work of redeeming all things, if I get any further out than the neighborhood, I get so overwhelmed by that. And so being able to focus in on a very small neighborhood and be involved in people's lives kind of comprehensively on that scale is something I feel like it still feels daunting and overwhelming, but I can at least be looking at specific individuals when I think that way. Another thing that I have found to be very true, and you mentioned Epic Life, you suggested that strong neighborhood identification has the potential to relativize differences. And I think in this age where we are so ultra polarized over so many things, one of the things that I have loved about being a neighborhood-focused church is being able to connect with the other neighborhood-focused churches that are geographically right there with me. So I've sat in the room with the Epic Life staff on numerous different occasions, and with the Salvation Army Church, and with the preschool that we run is housed in a United Evangelical Free Church in the neighborhood. And I feel more of an affinity with those churches than I do with the other Christian Reformed churches scattered, along the I-5 corridor, because we know the same people and we're being impacted by the same issues, and our people are being impacted by the same issues, which for us right now, I would say cost of living. I think probably all of our communities, cost of living is a huge one. And the impact, being a neighborhood church when no one can afford to live in your neighborhood has been one of the things that we've been wrestling with. We very much, we desire to live in the area, and yet the reality is that for my husband and I, we literally put a pin at 85th and Greenwood and drew concentric half-mile circles, and we ended up having to live outside of our furthest ring because we just could not afford to live closer. And so as a church of young families who are looking to purchase their first home, no one can afford to purchase in the neighborhood that we historically have felt called to. And so what does it look like then to very much believe in the neighborhood model of church and not be able to live in the neighborhood that you have felt called to? That is kind of our current challenge.
So I'll just be really transparent, because I always am. We're not very connected to very many church people at Bar Church. It's something that it's not intentional. A lot of it is a lot of our people don't have church backgrounds, and the church world is this really, especially in a city like Seattle, is this really tight inside lingo group of people, and frankly, we're just meeting people. We're like, oh yeah, we do this church thing too. And so we're in this unique season. I grew up going to church when I was really little and young, and went in elementary school and junior high, but didn't go from what I would call an age of reason. So I didn't go to church from 12 to 25. And so I was fostering and creating these relationships that were outside of the church realm, whereas most of my peers that work in church or ministry or whatever you want to call this thing that we're doing, they've been in rooms with each other for decades. They really have. Everyone in this sphere knows everyone. And so we're kind of these rebels, and some of that is really healthy and some of that's really unhealthy. So that's a balance, right? We get to try these things that maybe other churches or leaders can't, because they're more limited in their flexibility. And so one of the things I think that has been encouraging and exciting for me is to sit with people that are new friendships and relationships. Tyler was here earlier, my buddy Prentice, and guys who are working at other churches and also dreaming about other things. I think one of the things that we're really passionate about at Bar Church is we were fine being out on the bleeding edge of things and making a lot of mistakes, and then talking to other people that are trying to experiment as well, if that makes sense. So I regularly meet with pastors who are in existing paradigms and are asking questions that essentially are how do we do some of the things that you're doing within our context, which is really exciting. And also it's not we're the experts. We have a really small community of people. We're just, I'm not the expert for sure. And we're really, this isn't tongue in cheek, we're making things up as we go. But one of the beautiful things in that is we get to take some risks. Constantly. The riskiest things we do are not drinking beer at church. We do a lot of pretty interesting stuff. Well, we're really progressive theologically, which sounds again, this is, I think, relative to your environment. So really what that means is the church world doesn't really like you, but also nobody else does. because Seattle is a fairly, when we moved into our space, many people in the neighborhood that we're moving into were less than excited that we were there. So people started writing us bad reviews and sending us emails. And so we get feedback, let's call it nicely, from conservative ends of the spectrum, and we get feedback, to put it nicely, from people who don't want to see another church in their neighborhood. And so we're in this interesting balance, which is, I think, very Jesus-like, right? Jesus pissed off the Pharisees, but ultimately what gets him killed is he loses the mob when he refuses to be the warrior king. Anyway, so I feel like, so whenever I get really frustrated or bummed, I'm like, oh, maybe this is how it's supposed to be. So anyway, so I think being a progressive church is actually really, really risky, because you lose a lot of those tribal connections, because you said, we're just going to go out on our own and see what happens, if that makes sense. So we're working on our connections, because these are new relationships to me, quite frankly. So Martine is I like him, but I just met him.
Thank you. Don't make this about me, guys. So any other questions at this point? Still thinking, mulling? There's one. Oh, great. Okay, let me run the mic back to you.
Hi. So one of the...
Can you introduce your name and where you worship, if you worship, or where you live, and kind of where your context is, so that we can know?
All right. So we live in Edmonds. We go to church at Bethany Northeast. I'm Silas Sham, and I'm a pastor there. One of the questions I have is, in your different contexts, because there's so many represented, what does sacramentality look like in the ways that you structure worship and engage in like sacramental imagination? And what does that do, or what has that done in terms of engagement with specifically millennials, if it has done anything?
I just talked a lot, so I feel like I can give it away.
So my husband and I have been in the role of co-pastor at our church for about 3 years. And when we began, one of the things that we decided to do was to do a series on the Lord's Supper and a series on baptism, kind of to just give us an opportunity to focus on something that we felt was really foundational. And at the end of those sermon series, the response had been so positive as we reflected on the meaning of these physical reminders of spiritual realities, that we went from doing the Lord's Supper only once a month to doing it weekly, because we just felt like the significance of these practices is just too much to do it less frequently. And that was something that was resoundingly expressed by the congregation. So I think for myself, living in Seattle and maybe living in this time in our world, life is so loud and so fast, and there are so many things vying for your attention and your time, and in the physical reality. And you can exist your entire life on that level, even as a Christian, and hardly ever be pulled into the spiritual side of yourself. And what I love about the sacraments is that they are physical reminders of the spiritual. And I think that as we have celebrated communion weekly, it's been really profound for people to be on a consistent basis, have that tangible, engaging their senses in their faith, and to taste and see and smell this reminder that Christ was broken and died for me. So I think that's been very powerful. And I think for millennials, I would say the same thing, that having grown up completely in a technology age where disconnection and loneliness and a screen is always kind of dictating your view of reality, that the sacraments, baptism, Lord's Supper, are really powerful and are very meaningful.
Thanks. And so for me, it's difficult to answer because we have so many different churches. So maybe if I focus some on the English speaking to start with, one of the things I often say is the only wrong kind of church plan is the one that thinks it's the only way. And so some of our guys have really taken that to heart. And so there's great diversity in that. I would say in more of our English speaking, they tend to do more of the weekly now. In our church plants, our longer established churches, it might be once a month or once a quarter as far as rhythms. we're recording it, so I want to find the tactful way. Sometimes at some of the churches I've been, it's almost seemed perfunctory at times. In some of the established, some it's very meaningful, you know, and that's part of the reason why they do it less. That some of their reasoning is we want this to be a special thing. We don't want it just to become, hey, it's something we do every week in the service. What's been encouraging to me and very positive in our newer plants, the ones that are doing it, it is a very meaningful time, very much the remembrance of Christ's sacrifice for us. It's very evangelistic, both in the Lord's Supper and in baptism, as well as a way to honor Christ, a way to lift him up, but also as a reminder of what's ahead. I mean, Andrew Arthur, who's one of the main 3 churches focused on there, he just did a great message on it where he was talking about we're celebrating the wedding feast. You know, it's a reminder of what's ahead. And so along with that, other things that they do, and most of those, you know, in the traditional Baptist church, you're passing the plates with, you know, I don't know how much detail you want to get in. They're passing the plates, and you take out the little wafer, and you get the little juice glass that somebody either pumped that morning or took the plastic wrap off. That's not the way it is in the newer church plants. You know, it's either broken crackers or a piece of bread you're breaking yourself and dipping and taking in that way. Others will, along with that, there will be worship going on in terms of music. There will be sometimes artistry going on in some of the services. Actually, somebody painting something throughout the service that goes with that theme and builds on that even clear through that time. In the language churches, just briefly, again, great diversity as you can imagine, but for them, it carries beyond even what they do in the service to coming together and having a meal, not just for the sake of having a meal. It's celebrating. They don't get us white folks. You know, they're like, why do you guys leave after an hour and 15 minutes? They just can't get that concept. It's like, you know, and for many of them, they've suffered so much. We have many refugee churches. We were just talking about, we have one pastor that I met his wife yesterday for the first time because he had to flee his country after they got, you know, they haven't been married very long. And so she's finally here, you know. For them, there was such cost that those things have so much more meaning, I would say, in many ways, that they're moved to tears, not to put on tears, but just incredible gratitude for the opportunity to do that and do that freely. And so it brings that added meaning.
We don't know. We're making it up as we go, frankly. You know, I think most of our community's in that, like, wild deconstruction phase. All my friends that actually, you know, most of my friends actually don't have church backgrounds or don't ascribe to any faith background, most of them. But the ones that do, I think, are really in this heavy deconstruction phase. Bar Church, I think, in many ways represents okay, what house do we build after this, right? The bricks are all demolished. Everything's torn down, but, like, you still need a bathroom and a roof. And so we're in a unique season where we're trying to figure out how to do things in ways that feel genuinely like us. Even, like, the way you ask the question, it's always, like, I don't have a church background because I was, like, translating in my head. It was like being in an ER room with a doctor, and I'm just participant. I'm like, I think what he's asking is this, because there's just so much internal lingo that you just don't know, which is why you should, if you haven't gone to, like, something that makes you uncomfortable as a pastor, like yoga, if you've never been to yoga or CrossFit, you should go, because you'll feel what it feels like to every other person who walks into your church. You're like, oh, what are they talking about? How do I look? Oh, yeah, totally. Yeah. WOD, workout of the day. Anyway, I just think it's interesting. I would say the way we most embody sacrament is half of what we do is external. So I think, and again, this is a millennial, this isn't strategic, but young people don't need more information. They don't. They have the internet.
Amen.
So you're not going to say, I've had to, like, relinquish some of this control, but I'm just probably not going to say something more interesting than they could find on their phone in their pocket. So half of our Sundays we meet twice a month right now, and again, we're experimenting with everything. So we might be doing everything wrong. I mean that 100%. Every week I'm like, is this how we should be doing this? But one of our Sundays is internal focus. So we learn together, we hear from a guest speaker, or we talk, or we do something developmental. Or, like, a couple months ago, we essentially did, like, we were going to talk about relationships and friendship, but instead we did essentially like friendship speed dating, where like each table had a cup and we had like 100 people, and they just rotated every 3 minutes and asked, and they had to draw a thing out of a cup and ask like an actual question, and they could only pass once. So there was easy, medium, and hard questions. I think that's sacramental. And then the other half of our Sundays, we do something outside of our walls, theoretically. So sometimes I might be actually serving, like going and like making lunches, like partnering with nonprofits and making lunches, and then go and delivering to people who are homeless throughout our neighborhood and city. So like one of our first big events was we partnered with an organization called #LunchBag, and we made 2,000 lunches for people in the city and went to every single major shelter in the greater Seattle area and delivered lunches. I think that is sacrament. And half of all of our Sundays we do that because I do think this is why millennials, I think, are stopping going to church, because they don't need more information, they need more action. And they're over sitting in rows and learning and listening to a TED Talk. And I think that is also a really inaccurate view of the gospel. Jesus tells 42 parables and he performs 42 miracles, depending on how you define it. That tells us that half of his time was spent actually doing stuff. So we were like, I think that might be a pretty good model. So for us, sacrament is doing stuff, honestly.
Does that answer your question? Okay.
No, I mean, I just love the diversity of the way that question's even intuited. So yeah, I appreciate it.
Can I add a couple things?
Yes, please,
from
go
the
ahead.
research. One of the questions I mentioned before was a question about which theological labels would you put on your church. One of those options was sacramental. And if I'm remembering off the top of my head, I think the number of churches, or pastors I should say, who indicated sacramental was 6 times the number of churches that were actually in traditionally, classically sacramental traditions. So I would echo what especially Gary said, and even the move to the weekly. I saw a greater regularity, I would say, a practice of communion, interpreted differently actually in different kinds of churches. The other thing I want to add, though, and it's one of the 5 threads of practical wisdom that I unpack under the title of embodied, experiential, everyday spiritual. Have you read the book? Yeah. No, so sacramental doesn't just, what one runs through the 105 churches isn't just they do a lot of communion. It's actually more a focus on like an embodied, and so this is where the thread runs through the 3 folks you heard here. It's like we practice our spirituality with our bodies. So in a way, whatever your theology is around it, the beer is serving as a conduit of grace, right?
Agree.
So it's like, it may not be the body and blood of Christ, right? But it's an emphasis on we practice in our bodies, and we recognize the sacredness of everyday kinds of things like bar tables and sidewalks. I mean, one of the churches in the CRC network, Awake, I love this story because they did, and you might know this story better than I do, but this is how it was handed to me. They did a Stations of the Cross during Holy Week, in which they didn't do it in the church, they did it on the sidewalk. They fashioned trash from Aurora Avenue into stations because they had some artists. They set them up along the sidewalk. They processed, and they remembered the suffering of Christ in the presence of the suffering of their neighborhood. That's a way, to my mind, of recognizing the sacred, binding together the everyday and the sacred, and it's a sacramental spirituality, not just a practice of the sacraments. You see what I'm getting at there. So,
let me really quick wrap in a little and do a little plug for what we've been doing. I don't know if any of you have looked at our research yet, but I can affirm that. Actually, you need to stay up here because we got another question I know is coming your way. If you go to pivotnw.org, you'll find that we just released some research in the early part of the summer, and one of the indications is that embodiment is huge for young adults, that they want to go around the city and feed people. They want to do their workout of the day. They want to do yoga. And they want those things imbued with, to your question, a bit of sacramentality, if not a whole heck of a lot. So I think that the variation in finding out in the diversity of young adults, because that's another thing that of course we're all dealing with, is that the young adult population is the most diverse population in the United States. So you have a diversity across all spectrums, and I think that's the real value that you bring to our city, is your affirmation of the diversity of the church plants, and the spectruming of them. That they're not just isolated, boxes, but they're painted. I'm geeking out. I think we had another question. Okay.
I got the feeling that you felt. I'm Karen. I attend a couple different churches at this. We've been to many churches. We're new to Seattle, so I've hit most of them. Honestly, you're all saying, "Oh yeah," but I got the feeling that you felt like the neighborhood incarnation was the most balanced in terms of, especially of its outward view of society. Are there other things that you saw that were hopeful and healthy that we should know about?
Yeah. So that the connection between the way you assess a culture in your context, that is a pretty important one, because it gets sort of right to the heart of what does God have to say here. And as Leslie Newbegin would put it, God always says yes and no to a context, to a cultural environment. So the kind of advice that I give in the book is for churches that just seem to say, yes, 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 everything's great here. Get in touch with some people who have another outlook on your context, and you might not be able to hear it unless it's in line with like your valuing of other cultures, and then maybe you'll listen to a Latino community tell you that they see some problems with, say, the social progressivism of your environment or something. The other thing, and this is also true of the neighborhood, the neighborhood incarnation model, in my assessment, is the most congruent with missional theology. Each of the other three models are basically minorly tweaked historical traditions that were shaped before the developments of missional theology. So I think there's something beautiful that comes along with the idea that there's a yes and the no, is also the picture of an understanding of the gospel as the renewal of all things, in which evangelism is a part and a critical part, but not the whole. And justice, compassion, et cetera, are a part, a critical part, and not the whole. And so this is why, and most of the church falls on one side or the other, as far as whether they're comfortable with something or see it as actually valuable, as actually gospel work or not. So that would be the other thing, is to say, having a fuller orbed understanding of what actually is the gospel. And the gospel is the kingdom of heaven is near. It's at hand. It's among us. And we are called, if I can just do my little professorial thing here, we're not called to build the kingdom of heaven, but to enter and receive the kingdom of heaven. This is all the verbs that Jesus uses around the kingdom of heaven are about receiving and entering, which is about recognizing God is doing something and affirming and accepting and living into that. So all that to say, that's a challenge to more progressive churches, to say, just being a nice community is not fully participating in what God's doing, which is creating a new humanity, new redeemed humanity. And it's a challenge to the more conservative churches to say, just trying to bring people into relationship with God is not restoring all that's wrong. And in fact, the service, I should say, kudos to the Great Commission teams. They actually get more stuff done than generally speaking, and this is not speaking about your church, but new community churches. Hey, you got the hashtag lunch, so that's all right. But generally speaking, the new community churches talk a good, this is not a critique, but they talk about liberation and justice, but they do less of it than the conservative churches on the whole. They're more focused on having sort of a beautiful community, which is itself a form of mission, and a form of mission that evangelical churches could imagine more about how their organizational structures reflect the character of the kingdom of God. So I do want to follow up one more thing before I hand it back. the work I'm trying to do theologically in sort of my next project as well is very much, and I love the diversity of the folks we've got here, trying to say, as I said to my dad the other day, when God creates, God doesn't create individual creatures. God creates ecologies. God created the world with all these creatures that are interdependent and eat each other, and you know, this whole ecology. And what if we were to see the church as an ecology, not just that's a good church, that's a bad church? Now, there's critiques that I make, but I wanted to imagine, and I want to do some theological reflection around what do we say about the church if we look at the church as a whole rather than just faithful, not faithful, orthodox, not orthodox. So that's all.
Respond. So one of the things with the neighborhood incarnational, which I agree, going in as far as reaching your community and doing that, you really want to lead and serve as if you're pastoring that community. And we have guys that's very much their focus. They look at how do we bring the health, the holistic presence, the restoration from God, and it's by serving this community and loving this community and leading it. Each of the four has its pluses and its minuses. The challenge with the incarnational is it can become myopic, meaning that, well, then who's going to reach the rest? And so that's where it comes back to Great Commission. I mean, you talk about Great Commission. If you want to go to Acts, you don't want to sit down with Baptists. You want to say, what are your key verses? They're going to go to Matthew 28, and they're going to go to Acts 1:8. Mm-hmm. And so the idea of it is, in whatever context you're in, finding ways to cooperate. So the reason why we're able to do so much, we've got 100 plants. It's not because, for one, for sure, it's not because I'm that good. It's because there's, what is it? I'll forget now, 46, 47,000 churches in our network that are resourcing us to do that. And so, and then why we've got thousands of missionaries around the world. So it's no single church, no church in our group could do that or anywhere close to that. And so I think they need to be more in line with the neighborhood incarnational, but not give up the aspect of the practical. Like I say, we do have more. We have more stats, all those kinds of things. But it can, and just as you said in your book, if you're not careful though, it can all become about task. It can all become about, checking the numbers. And so that's why we keep wanting to focus back to relational. The other part I would say is that we're very intentional, at least we are in the local network, because I lead that, and it tends to take on your personality if you're the leader, is I have a saying that I often say is, don't build your house on another man's bones. And so what that means is, like you made a statement earlier, like evangelicals or this Great Commission group tends to say, well, we're not like that group. If I hear one of our guys doing that, it's like, okay, stop right there. We're not about what we're not. It's about what are we here to do, what are we called to do. And so that's a lot of the idea, even behind the coalition that we formed, is what can we do together? We all stay in our lane. None of us has changed our doctrine or theology, our relationships or those things with our parent organizations, whatever. But how can we help each other, serve one another, lift up one another, praise God for what he's doing through you? The reality is there's a thing where it's like, somebody said, you Southern Baptists think you're the only ones going to heaven. We say it's worse than that. We don't think all of us are getting in. It's this. The reality is there's an arrogance to think that any of us totally got this right, because God is infinite and we're finite beings trying to understand it. So we're trying to get it as right as we can. We're trying through the leading of the Holy Spirit to understand it the best we can, but to put ourselves in the place of judging and determining for others. And saying they're wrong, we're right. We don't do that. And so I speak a lot nationally, work in different organizations and things, and I often describe doing church planting in Seattle is like international missions without a passport. And I say that for two reasons. One is the diversity. The nations are coming here. Many of the places where we're having impact back in their home countries is because we're reaching their leaders here. And because we're recording it, I'm not going to get into what some of those examples are, okay? But the other reason is that open-handed. What are things that within our network we're close-handed about, but what are we open-handed? How can we help one another? And I believe, now this is anecdotally, and we've been trying to do research on it, we're one of the few places where we're seeing Christianity grow. And I know within our network we're growing. We used to say we're 0.5%. Now we're like 1% of the population. So we're seeing, and others are seeing some similar things to that. And people ask me often, why? Why is that? And I said, I think a big part of it, obviously it's God and what God's doing, what he's choosing to do, but there's a soil that's receptive because we're not doing that to each other. We're not trying to compete. We're not trying to badmouth somebody else. We're not in competition with what their style is. We're just trying, how can we bless you where we can? If we can't align, let's say, God bless you, and we'll move on. But where we can, we do.
Chris, there's a group within our Christian Reformed Church in this region that has been working on a paper that they're calling the Gospel Ecosystem. And I would love to hear the results of your next project, because as I read this, I feel like one of the feelings that I was left with was wanting to know the relationship between all of these new churches and the established church in Seattle, and what is the interchange and the interplay and the mutual benefit, because I believe that it goes both directions. And I think the one thing that is, I mentioned cost of living, and our experience right now is, for the first time in my life as pastor, I have the legitimate fear that we are going to be priced out of our neighborhood as a church, that renting a space and not having our own, space, suddenly rents are increasing to the point where we may not be able to afford to live here as a church. And yet, at the same time, there are established congregations who are shuttering, and there are church buildings that are being converted into condos. And, what does it look like for those churches to partner with new churches, and for kind of the death of one congregation to see new life of potentially dozens of new churches, and to view that not as failure, but as new life. Mm-hmm. So,
yeah, that's beautiful. That's beautiful. The project she was mentioning, I didn't say, I'm studying now Madison, Wisconsin, which has a lot in common with Seattle, as well as the whole county, and not just the new churches, but all the churches, about 350 churches, to try to do more theological work about the ecology, what is the church in this place, tell us about the nature of the church, and then what insights can we carry into our own practice of being church in our places.
I think we have time for one more question. John?
My name's John West, and I'm the pastor at Silverdale United Methodist Church, Kitsap Peninsula, just across from Seattle. Been there 2 years, and spent 7 years previous working on a new church start that was a project that we closed right before we left. And as a church planner, I can look back on some things and say, I wish some things I had done differently, or I wish I hadn't done that. Like, one thing is, I would never do a parachute drop. Parachute drop, that's lingo for you go into a community, you plant a church, and you don't have anything going on the ground. There's no community there. There's no core group. You don't know anybody. So you knock on a lot of doors, and you join the Chamber of Commerce. You do all these things, and you connect. But so I would never do that format, although the community connection we had was wonderful, and there were a lot of great things that happened. So the big question is, and Chris, through your study, have you, I don't know how much you've engaged with churches that did close, or projects that did not succeed, or that felt like they were stuck, or they were stalemated, or for those of you with projects that are moving forward, are there incidents or practices that you feel like, wish we hadn't gone down that road? That was unfortunate, that was hard, that didn't work in this context. Things that you wish you had not done, or that you've seen from neighbors or colleagues that had gone down a road and it turned out to be a dead end.
Well, I'll just answer real briefly that this study that I have done was a snapshot in time, not a longitudinal study. I'm planning to do a 10-year follow-up that will address some of those questions. In addition to saying, parachute is a recipe for urgency that can lead to bad practice, I would say, and this is maybe on the new community side, sometimes there's such a lack of sense of active mission beyond the healing of our own broken, often new community churches are for shipwrecked folks who've come out of churches that they felt harmed in. And so there's important work and identity around we're healing, a place for people to reapproach God and not seeing it through this toxic person or whatever. One of the churches that I worked with fairly closely, and it did not, and I think this is true of other new community churches, that was the extent of its sense of mission. And it therefore ended up not as a failure, but it was not sustainable. And they just basically said they never transferred to a sense of mission beyond their own healing. I'd say that is a danger, in part because from a missional perspective, I'm not sure healing can happen until you begin to think about a mission beyond your own healing. But that's sort of one for the Great Commission team and one for the new community dangers. I don't know, wish I hadn't done that.
Yeah, I've been a part of many church plant failures, so welcome. The water's warm. So I guess also I might be part of one right now. We'll see. so I don't know, man. Maybe some nights, yeah, some nights, no. I would say one major learning early on was just because you can doesn't mean you should. I worked for a really big church, and you're like, well, we got lots of bodies and money. I guess we'll keep on doing this. And I think that's a learning. Right now we are, okay, this is, I think, in a lot of what we do at Bar Church manifests out of this. I think the current model of church being open 3 hours a week is stupid. It makes no sense. In any other business sense, if you went to any business person in the entire universe that's run a successful business, you're like, hey, we got this business model, and we are going to be open Sunday mornings from 9 a.m. to 1. What do you think? You're like, what do you mean? What are you going to do the rest of the week? Or if you have a space, like, oh, cool, that's awesome. You got a cool space. What other things are you doing to be creative and resourceful and maximize your space? A lot of what we're doing with Bar Church and Cathedral is I didn't want to ever be leading or helping lead a community again where I felt like I couldn't be generous and direct us towards generosity in ways that we wanted to be. And it is so expensive to run the machine on a current model that is only open 4 hours a week. Just like if you opened a sandwich shop and you're open for 4 hours a week and you're like, it's really hard to pay rent. Someone would be like, if you brought someone in, they'd be like, you should be open more because 4 hours a week isn't going to pay rent. So I think what we're seeing with Seattle, this is again just anecdotal, and I think being really reinforced by the data is for hundreds of years, we had lots of resources, like the big church, tons of resources. And as one of my mentors says, when you have lots of resources, you stop being resourceful. And Seattle is one of these trending towards the nuns, which all of a sudden means if people don't show up, they're probably also not giving, which means there's less money, which means you have to think of more creative ways in which to do the things that you want to do. So I think this whole Pacific Northwest is like, okay, we want to keep on doing this because we think it matters and it means something. How do we do this in a sustainable fashion? Which is a lot of what we're trying to figure out with Bar Church and Cathedral. How do we maximize this shared space? How do we have events midweek that share some of the burden of rent and utilities? And how do we rent it to pop-up shops that want to do cool things in our community? And how do we rent it to people that want to do yoga on a Sunday? And so I think one of my massive, massive learnings, because I want us to be generous as a church community, and if we're going to be generous as a church community, it can and I do not think should depend solely on people's tithe. I think good stewardship is taking money and making more money. I think that's what good stewardship is. So we're like, okay, how do we be intentional? So I'll never, if this doesn't work, I'll go work at Amazon. But I won't ever dedicate my life to leading a community that doesn't strategically be resourceful on how we can be generous, if that makes sense. Which is really hard to do because it's super, super complex. But we're meeting in a space that is a co-working space and has events because they're obviously a wise group of people are like, oh, we should get creative because we got this awesome space that can be a resource to the people in our neighborhood so that we can do some of the things we want to do as well. Anyway.
So being a pastor of a church that has run a business for pretty much me, for the church, I'll speak kind of maybe a little bit the other side, that for me, I came into my role of pastor at Sanctuary feeling very much that the call of the church is to be a blessing to those who do not already experience the blessing of Christ. So to be reaching out beyond the walls of the church. And so when I came and I saw a church that was putting their money where their mouth was and actually running a coffee shop in the neighborhood in order to be a good neighbor, I was like, I want to be a part of that. 5 years into my role of the church, my role was 100% the coffee shop and sustaining the business of it, which was failing. And I just kept giving it more and more of myself, and our community kept giving it more and more of itself. And as the person also supposed to be responsible for discipleship in our community, that was completely atrophying during that season. And yet I think for the new community type models, I mean, for all of us that want to reach people that don't already know Jesus, if we're focusing on that outward focus without providing the spiritual care to ourselves and our congregations, we come to the end of ourselves, and whatever we are doing is destined for failure because we're doing it out of our own limited strength and not the infinite strength of the Lord. And so I think I experienced that personally. I hit a wall, and I had to take 9 months away in order to get spiritually well. But I think our congregation also had to go through a season of regrowth and focusing on our own spirit, so that whatever we were doing out in the world was coming from the right place. I would say that as a church trying to run a business, think really hard about it before you decide to like put all your eggs in that basket. Because I don't think churches are good at it, typically. So if you're good at it, could we hire you to come and like be good at it at our church?
I actually might only be good at it.
The normal people trained by seminaries are not very good at it.
Seriously, man.
But
I
that
thought I
doesn't-
was smart, and I am not a smart business person.
Gary, last word to you.
Yeah, so I've worked with hundreds of church plants, maybe thousands, so we don't have that much time of all the things I would say that we learned that we did wrong. I will say that the whole network and systems and things that we do to support plants, a lot of it came out of all the things I didn't have when I was a church planter. I wish I did. So I'd say the short version is keep learning from the mistakes. I hear what you say about parachute. Parachute's definitely harder. I would never go to the extreme of saying, to me it's an extreme of saying, don't ever parachute, because what happens is then you got places that don't have any gospel witness. And there are even places we're looking at right now in the Northwest that they have no true gospel witness. And so for us to say we're not going to send somebody in there, that's a problem. Now, what that really comes down to is don't plant alone. And so we strongly encourage, if you're going to parachute, at least go with another couple, because there's going to be some days you want to quit and you're going to need encouragement. And if it's you as a couple, well, what do? You just hope that you and the guy you're planting with isn't wanting to quit on the same day, and you encourage each other. And so we're very big about partnerships. We do a lot focusing on partnerships, and since we do a variety of plants, some are very organic, and those tend to do better with somebody that's already there. They're already in the community. They don't have to break into the cost of living. They do have the challenge of the escalating cost of living where they already are. Like I work some with church plants. This is kind of a volunteer gig up in Vancouver, BC. One of the guys I work with, he owns his home free and clear. He's not sure if he can stay in the city because of the taxes. It's so much more expensive in Vancouver, it makes Seattle look cheap. And so that's coming here. So even if you own your own home, you may be priced out of the city before long. And so there's also the issues of learning. We've really got to think collectively of not losing the spaces that we use, and because it's too hard to get them back. And yes, when we've sold some, we've used them and planted other churches, but we use them, the ones we use, we do have businesses. We do want them to be 24/7 if we could, and some actually are because of homeless ministries and stuff. But they also house several churches. It's God's facility, and so to say this is ours, we get it, and you guys, whatever, it doesn't work well. We got a guy actually up in Edmonds, Rock of Hope Church. One of my best friends, Dave Foster's the pastor there. They identified 10 people groups in their community, different languages as well as boomers and millennials. This morning, my church, I'm not the millennial, but most of them are, started meeting in that building. Now all 10 of those groups are represented in their facilities. They've got 13 different congregations going. They see see it. This is God's. So this is, and they're not renters. It's a partnership thing. So I think just, to give you the long list of all the things we've done wrong, I just say keep learning from the things we've done wrong. And again, thinking you've got it all figured out, or you're the first one. When I hear somebody go, man, we got it down, and we're bringing the gospel here, nobody else is doing it. There's an ignorance and an arrogance that is a big red flag. So for us, learn from those that have gone ahead of you.
Thank you. I know Pivot Northwest, we can definitely endorse partnership too. That's a really great final word, because as you said, sometimes we burn out and we need someone to step in, and having partners is a great way to lean into. And this is a partnership right here. All y'all coming in, our Cater Upper Crust, let's give them a hand. Woo. The folks at All Saints / The Commons. Brendan, thank you. He's back there making sure the coffee's hot. And is Caitlin in here? She's back there. Oh, she's got our drawing. Is this the universal symbol for drawing? We're gonna draw our 2 books. Yeah, here comes the drawing. Here comes the drawing. Okay, we're gonna have Chris. Because he's probably the most neutral, being from out of state. So, right. And you'll have to find his email to tell.
Huh? What do you mean?
Okay,
Luke,
the first one is
just got Luke.
Luke, that's Caitlin's husband. A little suspicious. Right. Maybe we'll pick another one. Let's go ahead and pick another one. I think I already bought her a book, or she can borrow mine.
I'm feeling around here.
I told her get everyone's name.
Oh, did you not put one in here?
Oh, she went around and grabbed everyone's name for their name tags. Do you not have a name tag?
Albert.
All right, there's one. We're going to do one more. Albert, digital or physical? Okay, I thought that would be the case.
If it's actually here and you want, I can sign it for you. Okay, the book. Well, Jennifer is the other winner.
Jennifer, all right. Jennifer, will you share with your community? Okay.
The name of the book, you were asking over here. The name of the book is Church Planting in Post-Christian Soil. I was delighted that it was
I will give you guys a physical one if you're going to pass it around. Sorry.
Published by Oxford University Press, probably the first and maybe the last book they'll ever publish in church planting. But and a little toot-toot. Can I do a little toot-toot of my own horn? It was featured by one of the top missiology journals as one of the 10 books to watch from last year, and got an award from the Illumination Book Awards, the gold in theology. So the book's done well, it's selling well, and it's being used in seminary classes and stuff like that. So it's really an honor. And
it's fun. And it's fun to be that representative.
Let me just say, and thank you to the work of Pivot. Thank you to each of you for the ways that you're willing to be here and bridge build and collaborate. And that's, one of the joys of it is just to have an occasion to bring people together, to meet, to hear, to learn from each other. That's I think, part of our witness. So.
And then who did I ask to pray? I asked one of you. Gary, can you give us a benediction?
Let's pray together. Our Heavenly Father, we are so grateful that you are with us, that you speak to us through your Spirit, that you've given us the wonderful gift of your Son. And Lord, we talk about strategies and statistics and things, but Lord, we know it's all coming back to what work you are doing. You're doing in this city we're sitting in. And God, we know that you love these people. You love this city. And you've cried over a city. And Lord, so we just pray that you will give us your heart for Seattle, and that you will allow us to engage fully with those that need to know of you, and those that are growing in you and with each other. God, we just trust it to you. We know that you are doing amazing things, and for every story that's been shared and every story we could share tonight, Lord, there are hundreds and thousands more. And we pray that that will increase, because we know that as that happens and this place continues to be loved and transformed for you, that the world will notice, the world will know. We thank you for Chris, Lord. We thank you for the work that he's done and compiling this, that we can learn from it. May it be a tool not only to help us here, but so many others as they read of the work that he's done. So, Lord, for all this, we thank you. We pray you give us safety going home tonight. We thank you for this in Jesus' name. Amen.
Please eat and drink what is left. And we do have some more tools for interacting a little bit with your questions. You can leave us with some questions. Find Chris and the pastors before they sneak out and give them a good, firm handshake. Thank you all. Visit our website. Send us questions, emails, everything. We want to hear from you, social media, all that. God bless.